Wife swap fantasy turns deadly. The crisp evening air carried the faint scent of pine. A perfect setting for what was meant to be a thrilling adventure. Two couples, strangers until weeks ago, gathered in a lavish cabin deep in the woods. Dimly lit candles flickered, casting shadows that danced on the wooden walls. Jason poured another glass of wine, his hands trembling slightly. He glanced at his wife, Emma, who sat across the room, laughing with the other man, Mark. Her laughter felt unfamiliar, too free, too unguarded. His stomach twisted, the wine souring on his tongue. The wives had swapped seats hours ago, aligning with their daring agreement. But Jason couldn't shake the unease creeping up his spine. Mark's wife, Lisa, brushed her hand across Jason's arm, a touch that felt both electric and cold. Her eyes locked onto his, dark and probing, as though peeling away his thoughts. The cabin grew warmer, but Jason's hands felt icy. A gust of wind howled outside, rattling the windows like a warning. Lisa leaned closer, her perfume overpowering, suffocating. "Relax," she whispered, her voice velvet smooth but hollow. Meanwhile, Emma disappeared into the adjacent room with Mark. Jason's pulse quickened. The sound of muffled laughter turned to silence. Too much silence. He stood abruptly, the chairs scraping against the floor. "Where's Emma?" he asked, his voice cracking. Lisa smiled, a glint of malice in her eyes. "She's enjoying herself," Lisa replied, almost purring. Jason bolted towards the closed door. His breath came in sharp, ragged gasps. His hand trembled as he grasped the doorknob, cold as ice. The room beyond was dark, save for a faint glow from a single lamp. Emma sat on the bed, her face pale and her eyes wide. Mark loomed behind her, his shadow stretching across the floor like a predator's. "Jason," Emma whispered, her voice barely audible. But it wasn't a plea. It was a warning. Before Jason could react, the lights flickered, plunging the room into darkness. A sharp, metallic sound cut through the silence, a blade unsheathed. Panic surged through Jason, his instincts screaming to run. The door slammed shut behind him. A low, menacing chuckle echoed in the dark. It wasn't Mark's voice. It wasn't Lisa's either. The air turned heavy, thick with dread. Jason's heart pounded as he reached for Emma. But she wasn't there. Then came the scream, high-pitched, piercing. It ripped through the cabin like a blade through flesh. The fantasy was over. The nightmare had begun. If you'd like a more detailed continuation or specific twists, let me know. Jason froze. The scream rattled him to his core, bouncing off the walls of the cabin like a haunting echo. "Emma," he yelled, his voice raw and desperate. The room stayed dark, save for slivers of moonlight creeping through the window. Jason's fingers fumbled for his phone, his breath shallow and frantic. The screen lit up, casting a faint glow on the room. But Emma wasn't there. Neither was Mark. A streak of crimson glistened on the floor, leading out of the room. Jason's legs felt like lead, but he forced himself to move. Each step toward the door felt heavier than the last. The hallway stretched endlessly in the dim light. The cabin, once cozy, now felt cavernous and cold. From somewhere ahead, Jason heard faint whispers. "Lisa," he called out, his voice trembling. There was no reply, only the sound of a creaking floorboard. He followed the trail of blood, his shoes sticky with every step. The whispers grew louder, more distinct. They weren't words, but something guttural, inhuman. At the end of the hall, Jason found the source. The living room, where they had all sat laughing hours ago, was now unrecognizable. The furniture was overturned, the wine glasses shattered. Mark was slumped in a corner, his eyes wide open and lifeless. A jagged wound stretched across his neck, his blood pooling around him. Jason's stomach churned, while rising to his throat. "Emma," he shouted again, his voice breaking. And then he saw her. She was standing in the middle of the room, her back to him. Her dress was torn, her hair disheveled. "Emma," he said, his voice softer now, a plea. But she didn't turn. As Jason took a cautious step closer, he noticed her hands. They were covered in blood, dripping onto the floor. His heart sank. "Emma," he whispered, reaching out to her. She finally turned, her face illuminated by the moonlight. Her eyes were empty, her expression void of recognition. But her lips moved, mouthing words Jason couldn't hear. Then, from behind him, came the low, guttural whisper again. Jason spun around, his phone shaking in his hand. There stood Lisa, a grin stretching unnaturally wide across her face. Her eyes gleamed, not with malice, but with something far worse, delight. "You should have listened," she said, her voice echoing unnaturally. This wasn't a game. It was a test. Jason backed away, his mind racing for a way out. But the door slammed shut, and the room plunged into darkness again. The last thing Jason saw was Emma, her blood-soaked hands reaching for him. And then the screams began anew. Would you like to explore an epilogue or dive into the origins of Lisa's sinister plan? The darkness swallowed Jason whole. His screams echoed back at him, bouncing off unseen walls. He flailed, searching for something, anything, to anchor him. But the floor beneath his feet felt like shifting sand, pulling him deeper into the void. Then silence. A crushing, suffocating silence. Jason blinked, and suddenly he was no longer in the cabin. The room he found himself in was stark white, blindingly bright, with no discernible walls or doors. Emma stood across from him, her dress pristine, her hands clean of blood. "Emma!" Jason called out, relief flooding his voice. But she didn't respond. Her eyes locked onto his, unblinking, her face an expressionless mask. "Emma, we have to get out of here," he shouted, stepping toward her. As he reached for her, the ground between them cracked, a jagged fissure opening like a hungry mouth. From the abyss below, a chilling wind rose, carrying with it whispers in a language Jason couldn't understand. He stumbled back, the icy gust freezing him to his core. Emma began to move, but not toward him. She stepped closer to the fissure, her bare feet grazing the edge. "Emma, stop!" Jason yelled, his voice cracking with desperation. She turned to him, her face now twisted in anguish. Her lips moved, but her voice was drowned out by the growing roar from the abyss. Jason strained to hear her, catching only fragments. "Wasn't me trapped, leave?" Before he could respond, a shadow emerged from the fissure. It rose, towering over them both, its form shifting and writhing like smoke. Two piercing red eyes burned within the darkness, locking onto Jason. A voice boomed, deep and guttural, shaking the room. "You broke the rules." Jason's knees buckled, the sheer force of the voice pressing down on him. "What rules?" he shouted, his voice trembling. The shadow's laughter echoed, cold and merciless. "You played a game you didn't understand." It extended a long, claw-like appendage toward Emma, wrapping around her waist. "No!" Jason screamed, lunging forward. But the moment he moved, chains shot up from the ground, binding his wrists and ankles. He struggled, the metal biting into his skin, drawing blood. Emma's face was streaked with tears as the shadow pulled her closer to the fissure. "Jason, I'm sorry," she sobbed. Her voice was the last thing he heard before she was dragged into the void. The fissure snapped shut, and the room plunged back into darkness. Jason collapsed, his body trembling, his mind racing. The chains dissolved, but he couldn't move. Then came the whispers again, circling him like vultures. "Your turn," they hissed. The ground beneath him began to crack, the same ominous fissures spreading outward. Jason clawed at the smooth, featureless floor, but it offered no grip. The last thing he saw was his own reflection in the red, glowing eyes of the shadow. And then he fell. Would you like an epilogue to reveal what truly happened, or leave the story open-ended for suspense? Jason's fall seemed endless. He tumbled through a void that pressed against him like a living, suffocating presence. His screams were swallowed by the darkness, leaving only silence. Then, with a jarring thud, he hit solid ground. Pain shot through his body, forcing a groan from his lips. He opened his eyes, but the world around him was distorted, like a nightmare brought to life. The ground was blackened and cracked, oozing a thick, crimson liquid that pulsed like a heartbeat. Above him, the sky was an endless swirl of dark clouds, streaked with lightning that illuminated grotesque shapes slithering within. A faint metallic tang filled the air, mingling with the stench of decay. Jason pushed himself to his feet, every muscle aching. In the distance, he saw Emma, or someone who looked like her. She stood motionless, her back to him, surrounded by a faint, eerie glow. "Emma," he shouted, his voice hoarse. She didn't move. Jason stumbled toward her, his footsteps squelching in the wet, pulsating ground. With each step, whispers grew louder around him, their tone mocking, taunting. "Fool! Traitor! Did you think this would end well?" He ignored them, his focus fixed on Emma. As he approached, the glow around her grew brighter, almost blinding. When he was just feet away, she turned slowly. Jason froze. It wasn't Emma. Her face was warped, half of it twisted into a grotesque, skeletal grin. Her eyes burned with the same red glow as the shadows. "Why did you let me fall?" she asked, her voice layered, as if a dozen voices spoke at once. Jason staggered back, his heart pounding. I didn't mean to," he stammered. "I tried to save you." The figure laughed, a chilling sound that echoed through the desolate landscape. "You never understood. This was never about saving anyone." The ground beneath Jason's feet trembled. The cracks spread, glowing with an ominous light. "You've been judged," the figure said, its voice dripping with malice. Suddenly, Jason felt something grab his ankle. He looked down to see black, clawed hands emerging from the ground, dragging him downward. He screamed, thrashing against the grip, but it was no use. As he was pulled under, the last thing he saw was the figure of Emma, watching silently, her skeletal grin widening. The whispers around him crescendoed into a deafening roar. "Welcome to your punishment," they hissed. And then everything went black. Would you like a continuation exploring Jason's fate in this twisted realm? Or should we leave the story at this chilling conclusion? Jason awoke in darkness. Not the kind of darkness where shadows lurk, but an all-encompassing void. It was suffocating, pressing against him from all sides. He tried to move, but his limbs were bound by unseen forces. The air around him was cold, like the breath of something ancient and malevolent. A faint sound began to emerge, distant at first, a rhythmic pounding, like a heartbeat. Thump, thump, thump. The sound grew louder, reverberating through his chest. With it came flashes of light, quick and disorienting. Images danced before his eyes. Emma's tear-streaked face, Mark's lifeless body, Lisa's twisted grin. Then came a voice. Deep, guttural, impossible to locate. "Jason, do you understand now?" He tried to speak, but his voice was caught in his throat. The bindings around him tightened, as if punishing him for his silence. "Answer," the voice commanded, its tone razor-sharp. "I don't," Jason croaked, his voice breaking. "I don't understand." The darkness pulsed, like it was alive. "You wanted excitement," the voice hissed. "You sought thrills. And now, you've found them." Jason's breath quickened. "This isn't what I wanted," he screamed, his voice echoing into the void. The voice laughed, a sound so cold it sent shivers down his spine. "Desire is a dangerous thing, Jason. It consumes, distorts, and destroys." Suddenly, the darkness parted, and Jason was thrust into a blinding light. When his vision adjusted, he found himself back in the cabin. But something was wrong. The furniture was pristine, the wine glasses untouched. Emma sat on the couch, laughing softly as if nothing had happened. Mark and Lisa were beside her, smiling, their faces serene. Jason blinked, his heart pounding. "Emma," he whispered, stepping closer. She looked up, her expression warm and inviting. "Jason, where have you been? We've been waiting for you." He froze. Her voice was perfect, too perfect. The same warmth, the same melody. But her eyes, they weren't hers. They glowed faintly red, just like the shadows. Mark and Lisa turned toward him, their smiles stretching unnaturally wide. "Come join us, Jason," Lisa said, her voice dripping with sweetness. Jason backed away, his hands trembling. No, this isn't real. The walls of the cabin began to close in, warping and twisting like melted wax. The three figures rose, their bodies elongating, their faces distorting into grotesque masks. "Stay with us, Jason," they said in unison, their voices a chilling harmony. "Forever." Jason spun around, searching for a way out. But the door was gone. The walls continued to close in, the air growing thick and stifling. Jason screamed, his voice swallowed by the rising shadows. The last thing he saw was Emma's face, her real face, flickering like a distant memory. And then silence. Jason's disappearance would go unnoticed for weeks. The cabin, when found, was abandoned, with no signs of the couples who had stayed there. But those who ventured too close swore they heard whispers, and the faint sound of laughter echoing through the woods. Would you like to add an epilogue hinting at the sinister origins of the shadow, or leave the mystery unresolved? Asterisk asterisk epilogue. The sinister origins asterisk asterisk. Years passed, and the cabin's story faded into obscurity. Locals warned travelers to avoid the area, calling it cursed, but few believed the tales. It became a whispered legend, a place of intrigue for thrill-seekers and skeptics. One crisp autumn evening, a journalist named Rachel Simmons arrived in the small town near the woods. She had heard of the cabin's dark history and was determined to uncover the truth. Equipped with cameras, recording equipment, and a skeptical mind, Rachel set out to investigate. The trail leading to the cabin was overgrown, the forest eerily quiet. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath as she approached. When she reached the cabin, it looked untouched, pristine, as if frozen in time. Rachel pushed open the creaking door and stepped inside. The air was heavy, thick with a metallic scent that made her stomach churn. The interior was exactly as described in old reports. Furniture arranged neatly, wine glasses still on the table, and an unsettling stillness. She set up her camera, speaking into the lens. The infamous cabin where 4 people mysteriously vanished. Tonight, we'll separate fact from fiction. As she explored, she found no signs of struggle, no bloodstains, no evidence of violence. It was as if the cabin had been waiting, untouched by time. But then Rachel noticed something, a faint glow emanating from the floorboards near the fireplace. She crouched down, prying up a loose plank, revealing a hidden compartment. Inside was an old journal, its leather cover cracked and worn. The pages were filled with strange symbols and chilling entries. One entry caught her eye, dated decades before Jason and the others vanished. Asterisk, we summon it tonight. The shadow answers only to desire. It promises what we crave most, but at a price. The others are gone now, their screams echoing in my mind. The cabin is no longer safe. If you found this, leave before it's too late. Asterisk. Rachel's hands trembled as she read the final line. The air around her grew colder, and the faint whispers began to rise. She spun around, her flashlight beams slicing through the darkness. But the cabin no longer looked the same. The walls stretched unnaturally, the furniture warped, and shadows began to seep from the corners, writhing like living things. Her camera captured it all. The whispers, the shadows, and finally, her scream. The footage would later be discovered by hikers, abandoned near the cabin's entrance. But Rachel was never seen again. The legend of the cabin grew, whispered in hushed tones by those who dared speak of it. It was no longer just a story about a wife swap gone wrong. It became a tale of greed, desire, and the darkness that lies in wait for those who dare to tempt it. And in the heart of the woods, the cabin still stands. Empty, yet alive, waiting for the next soul to enter and play its deadly game. Would you like the story expanded with more details about the shadow's origins, or leave the cabin's mystery intact?
The cabin's origins unveiled. Deep beneath the cabin, buried under layers of roots and rock, lay the true source of its malevolence. The shadow wasn't just a figment of fear, it was an ancient entity bound to this place long before the first settlers arrived. Centuries ago, the land was sacred to an indigenous tribe who believed it was a gateway to the spirit world. They warned of a being they called Kalokith, the devourer of desire. Kalokith thrived on human longing, feeding on those who sought to fulfill their darkest fantasies. The tribe built the cabin, not as a dwelling, but as a prison. Using sacred rituals, they trapped Kalokith within, sealing it with wards carved into the foundation. For generations, they guarded the site, ensuring no one entered and disturbed the balance. But time eroded their presence, and settlers arrived, unaware of the danger. The wards weakened, and Kalokitha's influence began to seep out, twisting the land around it. The first recorded tragedy occurred in 1857. A newlywed couple purchased the cabin, drawn by its isolated charm. Within days, their love turned to suspicion and rage. Neighbors discovered the husband's lifeless body in the woods, his eyes wide with terror. The wife was never found. Reports of similar incidents followed, couples disappearing, strange lights in the windows, whispers heard in the wind. The cabin gained a reputation as cursed, but its allure persisted. Those who entered often sought something: thrill, escape, or forbidden pleasure. Kalokith was patient. It fed on their desires, using them as bait to draw others in. The stronger the longing, the greater its power grew. When Rachel Simmons found the journal, she unwittingly uncovered the truth. But the journal wasn't just a warning. It was a trap. Kalokith used it to lure her deeper into its web, ensuring her fate was sealed the moment she stepped inside. The hikers who found Rachel's footage brought it to authorities, sparking a brief investigation. But the cabin was empty, and no trace of Rachel was ever found. Officials deemed it an unsolved case, and the story faded from the headlines. Years later, a thrill-seeker uploaded the footage online, reigniting interest in the cabin. Paranormal investigators, ghost hunters, and curious travelers flocked to the site, each hoping to uncover its secrets. Few returned, and those who did spoke of the same things: the whispers, the shifting shadows, the overwhelming sense of being watched. Kalokitha's hunger was endless, its power growing with each victim. The cabin remained, a silent predator in the woods, waiting for its next prey. Would you like a continuation exploring how someone might try to stop Kalokith, or should the legend remain a haunting cautionary tale? ***, the final attempt to end Kalokith ***. The cabin's legend reached the ears of Dr. Elena Marquez, a historian and folklore expert specializing in ancient rituals. Elena had spent her life studying lost traditions and unraveling the mysteries of forgotten deities. When she stumbled upon Rachel Simmons' footage online, she recognized something chillingly familiar. The symbols carved into the journal and faintly visible in the cabin matched those of an ancient protective ritual she had studied in her travels. A ritual designed not to banish an entity, but to trap it permanently. Elena knew the danger. Kalokith was not just a malevolent force, it was a being that thrived on manipulation and despair. But she couldn't ignore the growing number of disappearances tied to the cabin. With meticulous preparation, she assembled a team of trusted allies. Marcus, a survivalist who had navigated hostile terrains. Priya, a linguist fluent in the tribe's ancient dialects. And Father O'Connell, a priest with knowledge of exorcisms and spiritual combat. The group arrived at the edge of the forest on a moonless night, armed with sacred relics, protective symbols, and a copy of the tribe's original ritual. The plan was simple but perilous: enter the cabin, restore the wards, and seal Kalokith forever. The forest seemed to resist their presence. Branches clawed at their clothing, and the wind carried faint, mocking whispers. By the time they reached the clearing, the group felt the weight of unseen eyes upon them. The cabin loomed ahead, its windows dark and lifeless. But as they approached, a faint red glow emanated from within, pulsating like a heartbeat. "Stay focused," Elena whispered, gripping a leather-bound tome filled with ritual instructions. They stepped inside, and the air turned heavy, almost tangible. The shadows in the corners writhed, coalescing into vague, humanoid forms. Kalokith was aware of them. Elena spread the group into positions around the cabin, each tasked with inscribing sacred symbols onto the walls, floor, and ceiling. Priya chanted the ancient verses, her voice steady despite the oppressive atmosphere. But Kalokith didn't remain idle. The shadows grew bolder, whispering their fears, doubts, and buried regrets. "You'll fail," they hissed to Marcus, who froze mid-etching. "They'll abandon you, just like before." "You can't save anyone," they taunted Father O'Connell, echoing the failures he'd confessed in solitude. Even Elena wasn't immune. The whispers turned into voices she recognized, her late husband, her estranged daughter. "Why weren't you there for us?" they accused. But she gritted her teeth, focusing on the ritual. "Ignore them," she shouted. "They're lies." The group pushed through, completing the symbols as the cabin shook violently. Kalokitha's shadowy form began to rise, its glowing red eyes burning with fury. With a final, unified chant, Elena slammed the tome shut, activating the wards. The symbols glowed brightly, and the cabin trembled as Kalokith let out a deafening roar. The shadows recoiled, sucked toward the center of the room. Kalokitha's form twisted and shrank, pulled into the very foundation of the cabin. The glow faded, and silence fell. When the group emerged, the forest was still. The oppressive weight was gone, replaced by a sense of peace. Elena looked back at the cabin, its appearance now aged and crumbling, as if centuries of decay had caught up to it in moments. "It's over," she said, her voice weary but resolute. But as they walked away, none noticed the faint flicker of red light that briefly pulsed from the cabin's windows. Would you like to expand this ending with a twist that leaves the door open for Kalokitha's potential return, or let this resolution stand as the final chapter?
A twist in the shadows. As Elena and her team made their way back to the edge of the forest, the sense of relief began to settle over them. The cabin was silent, its malevolence seemingly subdued. But Marcus couldn't shake an odd sensation, a tingling on the back of his neck, as though something was watching him. He glanced over his shoulder. The cabin was still visible in the distance, its form shrouded in shadow. "Keep moving," Elena urged, her voice firm but tired. "We've done what we came to do." The group pressed on, reaching their vehicles just as dawn began to break. The first rays of sunlight painted the forest in soft gold, dispelling the lingering dread. As they packed their gear, Marcus noticed something odd on his arm. A faint, black mark shaped like a spiraling shadow. "Hey, Elena," he called, lifting his sleeve to show her. "What do you make of this?" Elena's face paled. The mark was identical to a symbol she had seen in the ritual book, an ancient glyph representing connection. "It's nothing," she said quickly, trying to mask her unease. "Probably just a bruise from the trip." Marcus frowned but shrugged it off, climbing into his truck. As the team dispersed, each heading their separate ways, Elena lingered in her car. She opened the ritual book, flipping through its worn pages until she found the glyph. Her stomach churned as she read the accompanying text. Asterisk, though the entity is bound, it may mark a vessel to ensure its survival. The mark is subtle at first, growing stronger as the connection deepens. Beware, for through the vessel, the entity may rise again. Asterisk, Elena slammed the book shut, her pulse racing. She grabbed her phone to call Marcus, but the line went straight to voicemail. Her heart sank as she remembered the faint red glow she'd seen in the cabin's windows. Kalokith wasn't gone. It had simply changed tactics. Far from the forest, Marcus sat in his living room, staring at the mark on his arm. It had grown darker, the edges twisting like smoke. He felt a strange pull in his chest, as if something deep within him was waking up. A voice whispered in his mind, soft, seductive, and chillingly familiar. "Marcus," it cooed, "we're just getting started." His eyes flickered red, glowing faintly in the dim light. The cabin's curse lived on, not bound to its decaying walls, but carried within its chosen vessel. And somewhere in the depths of the forest, the faint laughter of Kalokith echoed once more. Would you like to explore Marcus's transformation and Kalokith's new plan in a sequel? Asterisk, asterisk, the vessel awakens, asterisk, asterisk. Marcus couldn't sleep that night. The whispers grew louder, a constant murmur in his mind, blending with his own thoughts. When he closed his eyes, he saw visions of the cabin, its warped walls, its glowing shadows, and its ancient, unyielding presence. He tossed and turned, sweat soaking his sheets, as the voice inside him whispered promises. Freedom, power, desire fulfilled. Just let me in. By dawn, the mark on his arm had spread, curling upward like black vines crawling toward his chest. It pulsed faintly, matching the rhythm of his heartbeat. Elena was already on the road, speeding toward Marcus's home. The text she'd sent him the previous night remained unanswered, her calls still going to voicemail. Her gut told her she was running out of time. When she arrived, the house was eerily quiet. The blinds were drawn, and no lights were visible inside. She knocked on the door, her heart pounding. "Marcus, it's Elena. Open up." There was no response. She hesitated before turning the knob, finding it unlocked. As the door creaked open, a wave of cold air hit her, sending chills down her spine. The living room was in disarray. Furniture was overturned, picture frames shattered, and the walls were smeared with dark, unrecognizable symbols. "Marcus," she called, her voice trembling. A faint noise came from upstairs, a rhythmic thumping, like footsteps pacing back and forth. Elena climbed the stairs cautiously, gripping the ritual book tightly. Each step felt heavier than the last, the air thick with tension. When she reached the bedroom, she found Marcus standing in the center of the room. His back was to her, his shoulders rising and falling with labored breaths. "Marcus," she said softly. "It's me. I can help you." He turned slowly, and Elena gasped. His eyes were no longer his own. They glowed an intense red, and his face was etched with dark veins radiating from the mark on his arm. "You shouldn't have come," Marcus said, his voice layered with another, deeper tone. "Kalokith is free now. You can't stop us." Elena held her ground, clutching the ritual book. "You're still in there, Marcus. Fight it. You don't have to let it control you." But Marcus smiled, a cruel and unfamiliar expression. "Control? No, Elena. This is liberation. Kalokith doesn't enslave. He grants clarity." The shadows in the room began to move, creeping toward Elena like living things. She opened the book, frantically flipping to the page detailing the vessel's purification. The words were in the ancient tribal language, but she had memorized enough to begin. She started to chant, her voice steady despite the terror coursing through her veins. The shadows recoiled at first, their forms flickering and twisting. Marcus staggered, clutching his chest, his expression contorting between pain and rage. "You think you can banish me?" Kalokith roared through Marcus, his voice reverberating like thunder. "You don't understand the power you're defying." Elena pressed on, raising her voice as the shadows swirled violently. The room shook, objects flying off shelves as Kalokith fought back. But Marcus's voice broke through, faint and desperate. "Elena, please help me." She focused on him, pouring every ounce of her will into the chant. "Fight it, Marcus. You're stronger than it is." The mark on his arm began to fade, the black vines retreating inch by inch. Kalokith's screams filled the room, a cacophony of rage and desperation. Finally, with a final, guttural cry, the entity was expelled. The shadows dissipated, leaving the room eerily silent. Marcus collapsed to the floor, gasping for breath. Elena rushed to his side, relief washing over her. "It's over," she whispered. But as she helped him to his feet, Marcus looked at her with tear-filled eyes. "No, Elena," he said, his voice trembling. "It's not over. I can still feel it. Waiting." Elena knew this was only the beginning. Kalokith had been weakened, but not destroyed. The battle was far from over, and the price for Marcus's salvation might yet be higher than either of them could imagine. Would you like to explore their fight against Kalokith's lingering influence, or introduce a new twist in the entity's next move? The Lingering Shadow. Days passed after the ordeal in Marcus's home, but Elena couldn't shake the feeling that something was still wrong. Marcus appeared to be recovering physically, but his eyes were distant, haunted. The mark on his arm had disappeared, but the air around him felt heavy, like the echo of something that hadn't fully gone. They tried to move on, Elena returned to her research, poring over ancient texts to find any clue about how Kalokath could be completely destroyed. But nothing seemed definitive. The entity was ancient, its very nature woven into the fabric of human desire and darkness. One evening, as Elena sat in her study, a sudden chill filled the room. The lights flickered, and she froze, her heart pounding. From the corner of her eye, she saw it, shadows twisting unnaturally along the walls, as if drawn to her. Her phone buzzed on the desk, the screen lighting up with a single message from Marcus. "It's back. Help me." Elena's pulse quickened as she grabbed her things and rushed to his house. When she arrived, Marcus was waiting outside, his face pale and covered in sweat. The air around him seemed to ripple with an unnatural presence. "What's happening?" Elena asked, trying to steady her breathing. "I thought it was gone," Marcus whispered, his voice breaking. "I thought we had sealed it for good, but I can feel it growing inside me again. It never left." Elena looked around, noticing the familiar sense of unease that hung in the air. The same dark whispers were creeping at the edges of her mind, tempting her with thoughts of weakness. They entered the house together. But this time, the cabin fever didn't settle. It was far worse. The shadows moved independently of light, swirling like living things. The temperature dropped sharply, and the air grew thick with a heavy, suffocating presence. And then the voice came. "Elena? Marcus." It wasn't Marcus's voice, but the deep, resonating timbre of Kalokath. It echoed from every corner of the room, surrounding them with a sense of impending doom. "I warned you," the voice growled. "I cannot be banished by mere rituals. I am bound to this world by your desires, by your very need to control me. And I will never leave." Elena stepped forward, determined. She had learned from the mistakes of the past. Kalokath was too powerful for one person to stop. This time, they needed to be prepared. "We'll fight you together," Elena said, her voice steady, but her heart raced with fear. "You're a parasite, feeding on our weaknesses. We won't give you the power anymore." The shadows recoiled, but the voice only laughed. "You can't fight what's inside you." The room trembled as Kalokath's influence took hold, more aggressively than before. The walls seemed to close in around them, and Elena realized that this wasn't just a battle for survival. It was a war for their souls. Marcus collapsed to the floor, clutching his chest. "I can't fight it much longer, Elena. It's taking me again." "No!" Elena shouted, rushing to his side. But as she reached him, she felt a searing pain in her own chest. The shadows were creeping into her, too. In that moment, Elena understood. Kalokath wasn't just an entity. It was a part of them now, woven into the very fabric of their lives, their desires, their darkest corners. But she refused to let it win. Elena grabbed the book from her bag, its pages now dog-eared and weathered from their many attempts to destroy Kalokath. She opened it once more, finding the page that described the ultimate purification ritual. This time, the words felt different, stronger, filled with a finality that hadn't been there before. She began to chant, her voice louder, more forceful. The shadows writhed in agony, but the whispers of Kalokath only grew louder. Then, she felt it, a sudden surge of energy, like a bolt of lightning coursing through her. The cabin groaned, its foundation shaking as though the earth itself was trying to shake Kalokath loose. Kalokath's roar echoed through the room, desperate and furious. But this time it was not fighting her, it was trying to survive. Elena's chant grew more intense, reaching a crescendo. And then, with one final, blinding flash, the cabin fell silent. When the light dimmed, Elena collapsed to her knees. The oppressive presence had lifted, and the air was still once more. Marcus was unconscious beside her, but alive. The shadows were gone. Kalokath's influence had been broken. As Elena stood, looking around at the peaceful stillness, she realized the truth. Some forces, some entities are not meant to be defeated. They simply wait. And as she looked back at the house, a faint flicker of red light gleamed from the window, the faintest whisper echoing on the wind. "You cannot escape me." Would you like to further explore the aftermath of this battle? Or shall the story end with Kalokith's temporary defeat, leaving the door open for more dark secrets to be uncovered? The Echo of Kalokith. The morning after the battle, Elena stood alone in the empty house, her fingers brushing the cold walls. The air still felt strangely heavy, but the shadows had disappeared. The oppressive weight of Kalokith's presence had lifted. Yet, deep down, Elena knew it wasn't over. The house was quiet, too quiet, as if it was holding its breath, waiting for something. She turned to look at Marcus, still unconscious on the floor. His face was pale, sweat beading on his brow, but the shadows in his eyes had faded. It seemed that, for now, he had been freed from Kalokith's grasp. But Elena couldn't shake the feeling that Kalokith's curse wasn't something that could just be banished. It had seeped into their very beings, into their fears, their desires, their regrets. The ritual had worked for the moment, but would it last? She reached down to help Marcus up, her hands shaking. His eyes flickered open, and for a moment, he just stared at her confused. Then, recognition flooded back into him. "Elena," he whispered, his voice hoarse. "It's over, isn't it?" She hesitated, glancing toward the window, where the faint red light still flickered. "Maybe," she said quietly, her voice full of doubt. "But I don't think we've seen the last of Kalokith." Marcus shuddered at her words, as if something cold had brushed against him. "Then what do we do? We can't live like this, always waiting for it to come back." Elena took a deep breath, her resolve hardening. "We prepare, we learn, and we make sure that when it comes, we'll be ready." Days passed, and life slowly returned to normal, or as close to normal as it could be. Marcus and Elena kept in touch, always alert, always watching. They researched everything they could about Kalokith, desperate to find a way to fully sever the connection. But the more they dug, the darker the truth became. The entity wasn't bound to any physical place. It was tied to their own inner darkness. And no matter how far they ran, no matter how many rituals they performed, Kalokith would always find a way back. One evening, as Elena sat in her study, she received an anonymous package, unmarked, the return address empty. Inside, there was nothing but a single, weathered page. The handwriting was familiar, Marcus's. Asterisk, "I'm sorry, Elena. It has to be done. I have to let it in." Asterisk. The page crumbled in her hands as the chilling realization hit her. Marcus had been pulled back. The whispers she had fought so hard to ignore began to creep back into her mind. And this time, they were no longer just whispers. Kalokith was coming. And this time, it wasn't just a battle for Marcus's soul. It was a battle for everything. The final confrontation would come, not in the shadows of a cabin, but in the very hearts of those who had once tried to destroy him. And when Kalokith returned, there would be no turning back. Would you like to explore Marcus's final descent into Kalokith's influence? Or would you prefer a showdown where Elena confronts him once more, risking everything to save him? The descent. Elena stood frozen, the crumpled page in her hands a haunting reminder of what was coming. The whispers had returned, quiet at first, like a distant hum, but growing louder with each passing minute. She slammed the door to her study, her heart pounding. How could Marcus have done this? How could he have willingly opened himself up to Kalokith again? The air in her home felt thick, charged with something sinister. It was as though the very walls were breathing, pulsing with dark energy. Elena's phone buzzed, a text from Marcus. "I'm sorry, Elena. This is the only way." Tears welled up in her eyes as she read the message. She had saved him once, but now he had surrendered. "Marcus, no," she whispered to herself, slamming her fist against the wall. But deep down, Elena knew she couldn't save him anymore. Kalokith had already claimed him. This time, there was no fighting it. The next morning, Elena drove to Marcus's house, her mind racing with dread. Each turn of the wheel felt like a step toward a fate she couldn't escape. When she arrived, the house was dark, silent. The usual signs of life, lights, sounds, movement, were gone. It was as if the house itself had been swallowed by the darkness. Elena knocked on the door, her breath shallow, her pulse quickening. When no one answered, she turned the knob. The door creaked open, revealing a scene so stark it made her stomach turn. The furniture was arranged unnaturally, in a circle, as if preparing for some twisted ritual. Candles flickered on the floor, casting long, trembling shadows against the walls. In the center of the circle stood Marcus. His face was pale, his eyes dark and empty. "Marcus?" Elena called softly, stepping inside. His head snapped toward her, and she saw the familiar red glow in his eyes. The same glow that had haunted her nightmares. "Elena!" His voice was low, distorted, an echo of Kalokith, the entity twisting his words. "I did what I had to do. You don't understand." Elena stepped closer, but her feet felt heavy, as if she were walking through thick mud. The air grew colder with each step. The weight of Kalokith's influence pressed against her chest. "You didn't have to do this," she whispered. "You could have fought it. You're stronger than this." But Marcus just smiled, a smile that didn't belong to him. "You never understood, Elena. You thought you could save me. But Kalokith gives me what I always wanted. Power, freedom, release." Elena's heart twisted. This wasn't Marcus anymore. It was Kalokith, wearing his skin, speaking through his mouth. And then she felt it, a searing pain in her chest, a cold, suffocating pressure squeezing her heart. The darkness in the room seemed to expand, pulling her in. Kalokith's voice rumbled through the walls. "You can't stop me. You can't fight what is already inside you." The shadows began to move, curling around her, suffocating her in their embrace. Elena stumbled, gasping for breath, her fingers clutching at the air as if to grasp something, anything, to hold on to. "Marcus, please," she cried, her voice raw. "I never wanted this for you." But Marcus just stood there, unblinking, his lips curling into a grin. "I never needed saving, Elena. I've embraced the darkness. Now you will too." And in that moment, Elena felt a cold hand wrap around her heart. The shadows moved toward her, their grip tightening. The room was closing in, and she knew she had run out of time. Just as she felt herself slipping into the darkness, a flash of light erupted from the circle of candles. For a brief moment, everything stopped. Elena gasped as she was pulled away from the edge, a force outside of herself intervening. She looked up, her breath shaky, and saw the figure standing in the doorway. Her old mentor, the one who had first taught her about Kalokith's curse. "Elena!" he shouted, rushing toward her. "I warned you. This isn't a fight you can win alone." He reached out, grabbing her hand, and together they broke the circle of shadows. The grip on her heart loosened, and for the first time in what felt like an eternity, she could breathe again. But Marcus, Kalokith, remained in the center of the room, unshaken. The entity's laugh echoed off the walls. "You can't destroy me," it sneered. "I live within you. I feed off your fears. I am your greatest desire and your worst nightmare." The battle had only just begun. Would you like to explore Elena's fight alongside her mentor, or dive deeper into Marcus's complete transformation into Kalokith's vessel? The final stand. Elena's mind raced as her mentor pulled her to safety. The room, once filled with the oppressive darkness, now seemed to flicker with uncertainty. Kalokith's laughter echoed through the walls, taunting them, reminding them that the battle was far from over. Her mentor, Professor Rayner, looked at her with a grim expression. "You've seen what it's capable of, Elena. It feeds off your deepest fears and desires. We can't stop it by force alone. It thrives on your belief in its power." Elena's heart pounded. "I thought we could break the curse, destroy it for good. But now I don't know how to stop it." Rayner's eyes softened with pity. "It's not something you can destroy. Kalokith isn't a creature, not a being you can defeat with weapons or rituals. It's a part of you, a manifestation of human weakness." She could barely grasp his words. "But if it's part of us, how can we rid ourselves of it?" He gestured toward Marcus, who stood still in the center of the room, his eyes glowing with the entity's red fire. "The only way to defeat Kalokith is to face the darkness within. You have to confront what you fear the most. And in that confrontation, you'll take away its power. Elena's chest tightened at the thought. Could she really do that? Could she look into the abyss without falling in? Raynor continued. Kalokith will try to break you, use your emotions against you. But remember, fear is its weapon, and if you're not afraid of it, it has no hold on you. The shadows began to move again, swirling around them like predatory beasts. Marcus's voice, now completely submerged by Kalokith's, slithered through the air. You think you can destroy me? You think you can conquer what is part of your very soul? You're all fools. Elena stepped forward, her hands shaking, but her resolve solidifying. She knew what she had to do. Kalokith had thrived on her fear. Fear of losing Marcus. Fear of facing the truth of her own weaknesses. And now, she would turn it against him. She closed her eyes and took a deep breath, remembering the words of her mentor. Fear was the key. If she could confront it, acknowledge it, she could take away Kalokith's power. She focused on the image that haunted her most. The moment she had failed to save Marcus the first time, when she had almost lost him forever. That image had haunted her for so long. It had given Kalokith the foothold it needed to infiltrate her life. But now, instead of running from it, she stood firm. The image of Marcus's tortured face became clearer, but Elena didn't flinch. She stepped into the memory, facing it head-on. Kalokith screamed, its voice cracking as the shadows around them began to shrink. You cannot do this. You are nothing without me. But Elena's focus never wavered. She had learned the truth. She was not defined by her failures or fears. She could rise above them. With every step she took into the memory, she felt the shadows retreat. Kalokith's voice faltered, his form flickering like a dying flame. Marcus, Elena whispered, her eyes filling with tears. I'm not giving up on you. Not now, not ever. A surge of light exploded from her chest, and the darkness around them was torn apart. The red glow in Marcus's eyes flickered once before extinguishing. His body slumped, and the oppressive weight of Kalokith was finally lifted. Elena rushed to his side, her hands trembling as she checked for any sign of life. He was breathing, weakly but alive. Raynor stood behind her, nodding in approval. You did it, Elena. You freed him. But Elena could only stare at Marcus, her heart aching. The fight wasn't over. Kalokith was gone for now, but the darkness would always try to return. And she knew, deep inside, that she would have to keep fighting. Days passed, and Marcus recovered. But the house never felt the same. The shadows no longer whispered in the corners, but Elena knew they were only waiting. Kalokith had been defeated, but the battle between light and darkness would never truly end. Elena and Marcus stayed in touch with Raynor, learning more about how to protect themselves from the entity's return. But deep down, Elena understood that this was a fight for their souls, and one they could never fully escape. Kalokith might have been defeated today, but Elena was ready. Because sometimes the darkest battles are the ones we fight within ourselves. And she would never stop confronting the darkness, no matter how long it took. Would you like to explore the future of Elena and Marcus, or dive deeper into the mystery of Kalokith and the secrets that still lie hidden in the shadows? The hidden truth. As weeks passed, Elena and Marcus tried to rebuild their lives, but the aftermath of their encounter with Kalokith lingered like an unshakable fog. The house was quieter now, the shadows no longer creeping along the walls, but something else had taken their place, a silence that felt almost unnatural. Elena caught herself staring into the corners of rooms, wondering if something unseen was watching. Her dreams, once filled with the echoes of Kalokith's taunts, had shifted to more disturbing visions. Visions of Marcus, but not the man she had fought so hard to save. In these dreams, he was still lost, trapped in a world where Kalokith had taken control entirely. His eyes burned with the same red fire, and his smile was twisted, inhuman. One night, after a particularly unsettling dream, Elena awoke to find herself drenched in sweat. She sat up in bed, the air around her unnervingly cold. Marcus was asleep beside her, but his breathing was shallow, too shallow for comfort. She reached out, placing her hand on his chest. His skin felt cold, much colder than it should have been, A chill ran through her veins as she pulled her hand back, her heart racing. Suddenly, the room seemed darker, as if the very walls were closing in on her. Her pulse quickened, and the whispers returned, faint at first but growing louder. Asterisk, you can't escape. You'll never escape me. Asterisk. Elena froze, her eyes widening in horror. It was Kalokatha's voice, but it wasn't coming from Marcus. It was coming from within her, inside her own mind. She glanced at Marcus, his eyes still shut, but the familiar red glow flickered beneath his eyelids, like a warning. No, this couldn't be happening. Marcus? Elena whispered, but there was no answer. She shook him gently, then more forcefully. Still nothing. Then, in a moment of stark realization, she knew. Kalokath had never truly left. The entity had found a new way in, not through Marcus, but through her. Her fears, her doubts, her weaknesses. It had always been a part of her, lurking just beneath the surface. With that realization, the whispers grew louder, more insistent. Asterisk, you've been chosen. You were always meant to be mine. Asterisk. Elena's heart pounded in her chest. She had thought she was safe, that she had conquered the darkness. But the darkness had never left. It had only waited, biding its time. Desperate, Elena turned to Professor Rayner, who had been her mentor during the first battle with Kalokath. He listened in silence, his expression grave as she explained what was happening. This isn't good, Elena, Rayner said softly. Kalokath never fully leaves. It thrives on your internal battles, your emotions. But if it's inside you now, it's because you've let it in without realizing it. But how? Elena asked, her voice shaking. I fought it. I faced it head on. Rayner nodded slowly. You did, but you also left something behind. A part of yourself. A fear or regret that Kalokath was able to latch onto. Elena swallowed hard, guilt creeping into her chest. What do I do now? Rayner's eyes softened. We need to go deeper, into the very heart of your fears. If Kalokath is inside you, we can't fight it with rituals or spells. We need to confront it, face it down within your soul. The idea terrified Elena, but she knew he was right. There was no other choice. That night, with Rayner's guidance, Elena prepared herself for the final confrontation. The ritual they would perform would require her to relive the deepest, most painful moments of her life. Those moments Kalokath had been able to latch onto. The room was dark, the air thick with tension. Rayner sat beside her, his voice steady as he guided her through the process. Close your eyes, Elena. Let your fears come to the surface. You need to face them. As Elena did, images from her past flooded her mind. Failures, regrets, lost opportunities, and, most painful of all, the feeling that she had always been alone. The more she allowed herself to feel those fears, the more Kalokatha's presence grew stronger within her. The walls of the room began to distort, the shadows creeping closer. You can never escape me, Elena, Kalokatha's voice echoed, now louder than before. Asterisk, you are mine. You always have been. Asterisk. Elena fought the urge to back down. She clenched her fists, her breathing ragged. No, I won't let you win. Suddenly, in the midst of the swirling darkness, Elena saw something, a figure standing in the shadows. At first, she couldn't make out who it was, but then she realized. It was Marcus, or what was left of him. He looked at her with hollow eyes, his face expressionless. Elena, he whispered, his voice a distorted echo of his own. You're not alone in this. You never were. And in that moment, Elena knew what she had to do. She wasn't just fighting for herself. She was fighting for Marcus, for everything they had endured together. I am stronger than this, she whispered to herself. I will not be your vessel. I will not be your puppet. The shadows shrieked in fury as she broke free of Kalokatha's grip, her soul burning with defiance. In a final surge of power, Elena shattered the darkness. The red glow in her eyes flickered and then vanished. The room was silent. She had won. For now. But the battle, Elena knew, would never truly end. The darkness would always be waiting, and she would be ready. Would you like to explore what comes next for Elena and Marcus? Or would you like to dive deeper into the lingering threat of Kalokith's return? The final confrontation. Days passed, and the world outside seemed to continue as if nothing had changed. But Elena knew better. What had happened in the shadows of that house, what she had faced within herself, would never truly fade. Kalokith had been defeated for now, but the war within her soul was not over. Marcus, though alive, seemed distant. His recovery had been slow, his eyes occasionally flickering with a hint of that haunting red glow. The darkness had taken something from him, something that might never return. Elena could feel it too. Her fears, her vulnerabilities, had left scars that were too deep to heal overnight. The battles fought in the mind and heart were not as easily won as those in the physical world. But in her darkest hour, she had discovered something vital. She was stronger than she had ever known. One evening, as the sun began to dip below the horizon, painting the sky with deep shades of orange and purple, Elena and Marcus sat in silence. The world outside was quiet, as if it too was holding its breath. Elena turned to Marcus, her eyes meeting his, seeking a sign of the man she once knew. "Are you okay?" she asked softly. Marcus, his voice barely above a whisper, replied, "I don't know, but I'm trying." Elena nodded, squeezing his hand. She knew they couldn't erase the past, couldn't pretend it had never happened. But they could build a future, piece by piece, day by day. As the years passed, their lives slowly found balance. Elena became more determined, not just to protect herself, but to help others who had faced the darkness in their own lives. Marcus, too, found purpose, though he would never be the same man he was before Kalokith's grip had claimed him. Together, they built a life of purpose, one that stood as a testament to their resilience. They never forgot the lessons they had learned in the battle against Kalokith. That darkness would always try to claim what it could, but light, true, unwavering light, would always have the power to overcome it. And so, Elena and Marcus moved forward, no longer defined by their fears or the shadows of the past. They were no longer the victims of Kalokith's influence. They had won the war, and the scars, though deep, served as a reminder of their strength. In the end, they had conquered not just the darkness outside, but the darkness within. And that, Elena knew, was the only victory that truly mattered. As the sun dipped beneath the horizon one final time, Elena and Marcus walked into the future together, no longer afraid. The darkness may have had its moment, but the light would always be theirs.